Welcome back to the Social Web TV. And we're going to do a slightly different format today. It's just Joseph and me. No in the news section up front because there's really one big story that has continued to play out that it really gets to the core of why we started this show and why we keep doing it week after week. And that is what's going on with Facebook, the terms of service and the new governance principles, and really that core question of who owns your data. That's the thing that inspired us and got us fired up to do the Bill of Rights now, a year and a half ago. So what we thought we would do today is really try and dive deep on this topic and also give some feedback along the way in the spirit of the open governance model for terms of service that was pioneered today.
And I think also why, germane to why we're doing this show is there's been so much coverage of this whole terms of service fiasco, but no one's, I think, or it hasn't really been covered in terms of what are the core issues at stake here, because this is not really fundamentally about Facebook and terms of service legal wording and so forth. This is about really coming to terms with these fundamental tensions in data portability and user control that underlie the future of the social web, and that's really the meat of the issue. Yep. But as is so often the case, it's hard enough to understand that, especially when all this other stuff is going on. So if we can help break that down and help you, the viewer, understand exactly what's at stake here so that you can form your own opinion and understand what's going on and make your voice heard, I think that's probably the best service we could provide here.
So first off, and we covered this a little bit last week, the perception out there is that a new terms of service was rolled out as a kind of a land grab to get greater control over the user's content. And I think that's a complete misinterpretation of the real story here. And to look for that real truth, I think there's some nuggets that we can find in a couple of different sources. Joseph, do you want to pick out the salient paragraph from a blog post by Mark?
Yeah, so I think Mark, in the somewhat limited contact I've had with him, really does come from a very earnest and direct place, and I think it's always most useful to hear what he's saying in his own words. And he's written several blog posts on Facebook's blog as all this has been going on, which to me have really all kind of cut to the crux of the issue and are actually quite eloquent. So to me, when he first wrote this blog post called on Facebook, People Own and Control Their Information, and this was in response to the outcry that happened when they first changed their terms of service. Right. I think he really cuts to the issue, and of course we'll link this up. He says, "The interesting thing about this change in our terms is that it highlights the importance of these issues and their complexity. People want full ownership and control of their information so they can turn off access to it at any time. At the same time, people also want to be able to bring the information others have shared with them, like email addresses, phone numbers, photos, and so on, to other services and grant those services access to those people's information. These two positions are at odds with each other. There is no system today that enables me to share my email address with you and then simultaneously lets me control who you share it with and also lets you control what services you share it with." So, I mean, that is absolutely the essence of the issue that we were trying to deal with in the Bill of Rights. It's certainly that same tension that caused the kerfuffle around the Plaxo Facebook importer a year ago, the Scoblegate, right? Exactly these tensions, and people felt, there are obviously legitimate points on both sides, and they're obviously, in the extreme version, mutually exclusive.
So maybe to lay it out, specifically here is a question of, is the stuff in a social network, and in particular things like a friends list, is it like an address book, which in the case of an address book, there's some good clarity that my address book is mine, and whether I sync it with Outlook or Plaxo or whatever is really more my business than the business of any of the individuals whose data is in there as a result of them handing me a business card.
I think that this crispest way of looking at that is that, in the real world, once I've handed you my business card, I can't control what you do with that business card. I can't control what software you use to put it in, who you share it with. There just has to be trust there. There's no DRM on the business card, right?
Right, and I think I did a post on this, a sort of notion of social DRM, but I did it in response to a post by an influential thought leader from Microsoft, Dare Obasanjo, who is a frequent blogger in the space, and he laid out in a really excellent post kind of the two key schools of thought here. And I won't put words in his mouth, but the way I think of it is, one camp, the social sites are more like a nanny state, and their role is to prevent anything bad from happening as a result of data spilling out and being shared beyond the bounds of the wall, including scenarios like syncing it with other tools. And the other camp says, let's just trust the users. And if someone gives you permission to see this data on their profile, it's essentially equivalent to handing a business card. And the people in these two different camps have been passionate, but what was so striking in Dare's post is that essentially he had been in one camp, which is the network should be the protector, to the other camp, which is the network should trust the user, and therefore there should be the possibility that I can take that data that's been shared with me out to other things.
And you know, this may sound sort of philosophical, but I think the reason we're seeing all of this happening right now is because there are a lot of very practical advances that are happening right now that are being hindered by the murkiness around this tension. So, for example, you know, the big push that Facebook has been making over the last 6 months or so has been, you know, Facebook Connect, where you can take your social data and profile data out of the Facebook walled garden and across the rest of the web. And so there's a real set of practical questions there about, do those sites get to keep a copy of that data? Do they get to let the users share them with additional people on that site who aren't also their friends on Facebook? You know, what happens when something changes on Facebook? You know, how fast does that have to move, and can it always move? And then a related thing has been this move into mobile, right? So, you know, people love the Facebook iPhone app, and in order for it to work where I can see a friend and click and call their cell phone number or click and send them an email, they have to pull down the full contact information like Zuck says in his post. Whereas, you know, that was what was not okay was doing that in the past with things like Scoblegate. And so you sort of can't have it both ways, right? People clearly see the benefit of saying, well, of course I want to have access to that information in a tool like my mobile phone. At the same time, once the data's out, you really do have to trust the users and the services that they won't abuse that, because you just can't have it both ways. And so, you know, I think that's what's really bringing this issue to a head. And it really is the case that what type of software and experiences are going to be able to be built on these platforms depends a lot on which side of the issue we ultimately resolve to.
So I think what's going on here is that as an industry, there's a maturation process underway, and now more and more folks are getting to this realization, they're coming to it from a variety of different experiences in building products, that we do need to shift the model over to one where we ultimately are trusting the users and trusting the vitality of the social contract rather than using technological means to try and enforce a social DRM, if you will. So now fast forward to just recent days, Facebook has, in the wake of reverting to the older version of the TOS, has come out with something pretty radical and new, which is not only just a revision to the TOS, but more fundamentally a rethinking of how they will engage with the user base to roll TOS going forward. And they've got a set of principles that they've outlined, as well as a new governance model where they're seeking feedback from the community of users and giving a voice to actually figuring out, do we make the changes that we'd like to make? And in a post, the proposed Facebook principles from Elliot Schrage, some of the really great stuff in here, like bullet number 2, ownership and control of information. People should own their information. They should have the freedom to share it with anyone they want and take it with them anywhere they want, including removing it from the Facebook service. People should have the freedom to decide with whom they will share their information and to set privacy controls to protect those choices. Those controls, however, are not capable of limiting how those who have received information may use it, particularly outside the Facebook service.
So that really speaks directly to what we were just talking about. And I think you're absolutely right that it's a maturity thing that, you know, there was, of course, no one would argue that in the real world, once I give you my business card, I can't stop you from doing something else with it. But I think there was a hope that maybe the digital world would be different, and maybe it would allow this have your cake and eat it too scenario where I can sort of let my information be shared all over the place and yet in an instant pull it all back to me. And I think what Facebook and others are realizing is that the digital world is sufficiently complex and heterogeneous, just like the real world, that you really can't always put the genie back in the bottle. If that information is down on my cell phone, if it's been emailed to me, if I've got an SMS, if it's in a different tool, there's just no technical solution that lets you pull it all back out. And even if there were, it's not clear that that's respecting the rights of all the people who have had that data shared with. If all of a sudden my address book just got deleted, it's like, that doesn't really make sense. And so you sort of have to, I think, come to that conclusion that no, the online world really is like the offline world. And so, well, how does the offline world work? It fundamentally works with trust and a social contract. And maybe some of these technologies can help limit the harm if you want to pull some data back, at least it, kind of like the email recall feature in Outlook. It doesn't work perfectly, but it's often better than nothing. But if users don't understand that you really are on your own and you really do have to have responsibility for how you share that data, I think the worry is people will get a kind of a false sense of security where they think, oh, I can do whatever I want, and Facebook or some other service will come and magically save me if I do something wrong. And instead, that maturity is no, as much as we'd like to, ultimately this is on your shoulders. And so I think it's very courageous for Facebook to be pointing that out to their users, because of course it would be nice to think that you could have this magic comfort zone, but it's just not the way the world seems to work.
I mean, ultimately, we need to we need to all collectively grow up and realize we should be careful who we connect with, and we should be mindful at the time we're sharing something that there's some set of permissions around that.
Right.
So I think we're big fans of the direction that Facebook is now pointing in. Big fans also of the open process they want to go through to get feedback. And in that spirit, I think you want to give a little bit of feedback and maybe a shout out to Mark Cantor, who's been on our show, who also gave a great shout out to Facebook for their moves, but also pointed out a couple of areas where the document as currently constructed may not yet meet all the needs. I think Mark raises a question in his blog post, which we'll link to, that it's not clear yet that there'll be access to the email addresses, which are a pretty critical piece of information for looking up users and things like that.
I think it's interesting that that's an explicit example that Zuck referred to in his post, but the question is, again, does that end up showing up in the fine-grained details? It's certainly not part of the APIs now, and one of the specific points in the Facebook principles is that there should be APIs for all of the data that you can see on the social network. They very explicitly say that. And
then section 9 of the document is directly talking about what developers and operators of websites that are connecting with Facebook in some way can do. And 3 bullets that Mark Cantor pointed out. 9.2.1, you will only use the data you receive for your application, and will only use it in connection with Facebook. So that raises a question of whether one could actually do things like synchronize the data with one other tool or 2 other tools.
Or can you share it with people who aren't on Facebook, even with the user's permission? I think it also highlights there was this controversy over Google Friend Connect, which was trying to sort of be a middleman and help lots of sites get access to lots of social networks. It's not clear whether your application in that case is Friend Connect or the application using Friend Connect. Where does that barrier lie? So that's an important area to clarify.
Then 9.2.7, we can limit your access to data.
Again, more details there would really be helpful.
9.2.8, you will not transfer the data you receive from us without our prior consent. That one's kind of a head scratcher because a lot of the scenarios that we want to enable are fundamentally about that, and I don't know if that's a one-time consent or...
Right, is that like you have to get your application approved, or it's not enough for the user to say, hey, please move my data around, or...
That said, what an encouraging and exciting development to see this. I think...
It's absolutely huge. I mean, this is something, like I said, this has been the kind of cloud, the elephant in the room, if you will, hanging over the social web, and clearly Facebook is such an important part of the social web just by their sheer size and their ability to innovate. And this to me feels, if not quite a 180 from where they were a year ago, certainly a lot more sort of willingness to deal with the admittedly kind of dirtiness of the real world and the fact that you can't have perfect control over things, but yet doing it in a way that I think is ultimately very positive about encouraging trust and responsibility and transparency. And so I think it's a wonderful thing for the industry, and I just hope that we can all focus more on that meat rather than on the details of how it all sort of rolls out, because I would hate to miss the good stuff here.
Yep. I should probably point out that late last evening I invited Mark to come on the show, but I hadn't realized he had previously been invited by the Today Show. So he is in New York instead of here. I think I could understand that trade-off.
Right. I mean, we're big, but not quite that big yet.
Yeah. Anyway, I hope this has been a helpful episode at getting at what we think is the most important issue out there in the whole social web space.
If you've got questions or other things you don't get or things where you think that they're saying one thing and doing another thing, leave a comment and we'll respond. I mean, This is obviously an area that we're very deeply involved with and very passionate about, so maybe we can use this as a starting point for even further discussion of the real substance of the principles and the overall issues surrounding this idea of data portability on the web.
Certainly encourage people as well to engage in the process directly with Facebook.
They've got a group set up.
Yeah. Cool. Well, onward and upward. I think we're going to see even bigger things coming as this stuff unfolds and we really move to a model where we are trusting users, because that opens up so many good scenarios that are not possible in a world of social DRM.
If these principles really are allowed to stand by the community, which I certainly hope they are, I think you haven't seen nothing yet in terms of the amount of innovation that could really take place on top of that. Once it really is just a matter of users saying, I want to use this, and they don't have to ask permission, and it can just work. I mean, that's what made the web work. So I'd love to see it happen on the social web too. And to stay on top of all of these developments and more, make sure to come back, especially next week, for another exciting episode of The Social Web TV.